myself, and I have to believe it, but that's something that I have not documented. But anyway, that's part of it. But old William Warren Orcutt never seen this sister, and I'll digress again. When they were coming across to come to this part of the world, the young lady that I'm talking about wanted to stay with her aunt in Kansas. And the family finally consented. They left her there. She never did return with the family. She was born and raised with her aunt. She stayed in Kansas all that time and never seen the family thereafter. She said they conversed by letter, but they never did physically see each other. So William Warren Orcutt never really seen his sister after that. Okay, but William Warren Orcutt, after graduating from Stanford, thought he owed something to Stewart and the board of directors of Unocal, of the Union Oil Company of California. Now, the directors of the Union Oil Company of California didn't think much of this upstart kid that had a degree in what we call civil engineering and geology, and they were still used to doing it the old-fashioned way. But this kid took the Los Alamos Valley to the south, the Wasno Valley to the north, the ocean to the west, and the mountains that we see over here to the east, and he walked as much of it as he possibly could, and then he plotted where he thought the most prevalent prospects were for oil. He submitted this letter and his findings to the board of directors free of charge in the year 1901, and I have a copy of that letter, and I have a letter of his prospectus and the whole thing. Lyman Stewart had one hell of a time trying to convince the board of directors to act on this young man's concerns or what he felt was good. But nonetheless, they did, I guess, at much of the direction of Lyman Stewart. And they picked up 77,000 more acres of land, or 77,000 acres of land, in what is now Santa Barbara County, all on the hearsay of William Warren Orcutt. He was known as the father of geology. There was nobody in his time that was doing what he was doing, and he discovered most of the oil fields of the world. Saudi Arabia, most of Texas, most of Oklahoma. He was a gentleman that really knew what he was doing when it came to that. Anyway, to get back to this part of the world, a number of other oil companies were springing up in the meantime because there were small discoveries being made. The very first one was the Western Union Oil Company on the Jose and Marie Carriaga Ranch, which is just a little bit away from where we sit, maybe about 1.25 miles in this direction. They drilled 3 wells, all of which were dry, and on the 4th one at 1,673 feet, they hit a 20-barrel flowing oil well. That means it's coming out of the surface and going over the top, and it was a producing oil well. Well, this made old William Warren Orcutt very happy because this was just on the periphery of where he had told the Union Oil Company to purchase. So this was, okay, the Pinal Dome Company, which is right near where you're at, they drilled some wells, they got production. This was all great for old Orcutt. But he had laid out his stakes where he wanted to go, but one of the things that threw a monkey wrench in it was that they had to go to properties that they had a lease on, had not purchased, but on the Epheson property, and that was in Lompoc, California. And the Ephesons were very intelligent people, and they said, if you haven't finished drilling a well or proved up a well by December 31st of 1902, you're out of here. And so, in a record 65 days, starting in June, they developed the well, they developed the water, they did the whole 9 yards, got the well down, and at 3,332 feet, they hit a 3,950-barrel oil well flowing over the hill at Lompoc, California. This was their very first attempt. It was called Hill Number 1, and we'll get into some more about that in a second. But the next thing was, of course, the big thing was Old Maud, and I think most of you in this room have probably heard the story of Old Maud, but it was also known as the Kaiser or Hartnell Number 1. William Warren Orcutt told them where he wanted it, right there. Jack Reed and company went up and actually physically did the staking. My grandfather comes into play about this time. The year is 1904, June the 22nd, very hot summer day. And they're going up the hill with the boiler and all the materials on the wagon. The wagon hits a badger hole or whatever. The axle breaks, the boiler falls off, and they're about 350 yards short of where in the heck they're supposed to be. Well, hot summer day, nobody wanted to do anything about recovering it, putting it back on the wagon, so they built the location right where the boiler fell. Now, when Orcutt was in Fresno, if you will, or in the San Joaquin Valley, looking at some other prospects, and when old Jack Reed and all of them got back, which was about a week and a half later, they were hopping mad, but they weren't mad enough to make them tear everything out that they had done, and so they let it stand where the well, where they built the location. On December, again, the 21st of 1904, the ground began to rumble and the well began to come in. Now you got to realize that in those days you're drilling with cable tools, and it's a percussion bit. You just simply lift and drop, and your indentation to the ground, and you go in with a baler and you bail out the chips with water, bail out the chips, and that's how you make hole, and that's how you go forward. But as you do so, you drive casing so to protect the hole from sloughing or caving in on itself, and that was called cable tool drilling. But on the surface, you didn't have a darn thing protecting you from Mother Nature. In this case, they did. They were doing this. The thing of the time period was to have for back of a better attempt, was a clip gate valve, which is nothing but a large opening sliding gate valve that they were actually physically drilling through. Well, my granddad says that the ground began to rubble and she began to come in. They're at roughly 3,700 some odd feet. And she began to come over here. Well, they ran over and they cut off the cable and they closed the gate valve. But enough fluids and materials and rocks and debris and sand and all of that kind of stuff had gone by the gate valve and actually cut the seat out of the gate valve. So when they cranked her shut, they really didn't have anything to seat against. The fluid kept on coming, and actually physically cut the gate valve off of the surface of the pipe string sticking out of the conductor pipe sticking out of the well. So you just had an open hole in a free-flowing well. Well, this well began to flow over the crown, actually blew the rig down, and she flowed at the rate, in the first 100 days, she flowed 1 million barrels. And how did they know that they had 1 million barrels? They dug a pit in the ground, 15 feet long, as deep as they could dig it, exactly 3 feet wide, and then stuck a stick in there and measured the number of inches that the oil was flowing in it. That's the way the miners measured water in the mining company, or up in the gold rush days. And it was flowing 39 inches deep, which was 39 minor inches, which is equivalent to about 12,000 barrels of oil a day. Now she flowed, in the first 100 days she did 1 million barrels. The first 2 years she did 3 million barrels. In her lifetime she did over 6 million barrels. She served both World War I, World War II, Korean. Anyway, she finally stopped producing in 1965. In 1918, I'll digress for a second, she was badly hurt by debris and so forth. They had to go in, swedge out the casing and do a lot of work on her in 18. But anyway, that was the war years, and they put her back on production. And when she last was producing in the 1950s, doing 175 barrels a day, and she produced up until 1965, and she was abandoned in 1981, 1982, and finally put to rest. But what did they do with this? And we're going to show some pictures here in a minute. They actually just physically dammed up the canyon and let the oil flow up against the dams. And they did a whole series of dams all the way down to almost where Highway 1 goes out through this part of the country. Okay, I can't think of anything else I want to tell you, but let's go through this pictorially. And I think this is the part where you will actually have a lot of entertainment and see some things that I've been talking about, but you're also going to see a lot about Orcutt in these slides. This map depicts the oil fields of Santa Barbara County, of which we're going to be talking a lot about tonight. In the center, of course, is Orcutt, the town of Orcutt, and the Orcutt oil field depicted in the crosshatch areas. Slightly above that is the Santa Maria Valley field, and up in the far left-hand corner is the Avila Beach area, or Port Hartford, that we're going to talk about quite a bit about tonight. Remember I talked about Judge Dryden that dug pits in the ground alongside? This is old Judge Dryden. How'd you like to go before that old boy before his court? I don't know, he looked pretty stern to me. Remember I talked about Andreas Pico, the first guy to light lamps in California with oil from oil seeps? That was Andreas Pico. Remember old Benjamin Silliman? He came out here and did all them wonderful things and sent for the money to develop the oil fields. Here's Thomas Scott, the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Let me digress here just a second. He thought that, gosh, we got oil in Pennsylvania, and if we got oil in California, maybe the railroads can run all the way across the country on oil. You got to think of that time period. They were cutting trees like you can't believe for timber, and it was further and further and further away from the railroad track. So their great push was to try to get an oil burning railroad car that they could actually run on oil and not have to cut trees. And this was his hope, that he could actually have a transcontinental railroad, and of course it eventually came to pass, but that was his early thoughts on the deal. Here's old Thomas Bard I talked about, that came out with the money and developed the very first wells in Ventura, County. Here's old Lyman Stewart at an early age, the founder of the Union Oil Company. Here's William Hardison, his partner. I've got a hell of a lot of good stories about these two characters. They probably lost and made 10 or 15 fortunes in excess of $10 million, and then would lose them all on drilling efforts and then start all over again and do it again. Here is William Warren Orcutt as he looked as a young man. They named the town after William Warren Orcutt. He didn't like that. He never lived in this town, but he spent a lot of time here. He laid out the town site. Why? He needed, when the oil was discovered in Old Maud in 1904, I got to tell you that in all of the oil wells all across the world, Old Maud really put the oil industry on the map. Why? Because before that time, most people thought that the oil business was just going to be a flash in the pan. There was not going to be enough to do any good, to do anything exciting. But when Old Maud came in for 12,000 barrels of oil a day, the bankers began to loosen up, and people were able to get money to go out and prospect and do such things, and so it really turned the tide for the oil industry. Now, William Warren Orcutt, the town was named after, he said it was like naming a cheap cigar after a cheap actress, and I don't know what he meant by that, but nonetheless, he was not much in favor of naming the town. It was named by Clark, who was Clark Avenue over here. He was the vice president of the Pacific Coast Railroad, and William Warren Orcutt sat on the board of directors of that, along with some other notables in this part of the world, and that's how he got the name. This one I haven't even talked about. This gentleman, as much education as William Warren Orcutt had, this gentleman had no education at all, never attended a day of schooling, but his name was Frank Hill, and he was probably a genius in his own right, because he developed many of the things that the oil companies even use today as far as tools and downhole tools, surface equipment, and technology. He developed a process in which he could shut the water off in an oil well. Now, when I say water, when you drill an oil well, especially in this part of the world, you drill into saltwater formations. There's no market for water. You can't sell water. Nobody wants to buy water, not salt water, that is. And so you had to separate it from the oil. How in the heck do you do that? He took a bottom dump baler, which is nothing more than a bucket to you folks, put the concrete, filled it full of concrete, put it down in the well, opened it up the bottom, let it fall into the well, let it set up and solidify, then would go back and drill a hole through the concrete, therefore shutting off the water-bearing zones and going into the oil-bearing zones. And he got so proficient at it that it was a great technical advance in the development of oil. But the Union Oil Company of California never took out the patents on it or took up the rights on it. The Standard Oil Company of California did, and until 1956, Unocal, as well as all the other companies, had to pay a royalty to Standard Oil Company of California for the right to use that invention, which was done by a Union Oil Company professor. Here he is in later years at that very first well he cemented, and today, as we sit here at Lompoc, California, there's actually a plaque and a dedication. It's a historical site, the very first cemented well in the state of in the United States. Here we are at star number 1, the very first well in Ojai area and Santa Paula area that I talked about. We just don't have time to get into a lot of stuff. Here's a typical drilling crew. You can see the young man in the center there. I don't think we'd allow kids on the site in these days, but there were several kids in the picture. Sisquoc area. This is the very first well on the Jose Marie Carriaga Ranch, the 20-barrel oil well that was flowing that I talked about after they had drilled on the Western Union Oil Company's prospects, some very famous. Here we are at hill number 1, developing water for the oil well at hill number 1 in Lompoc. The year is about 1902 there in that picture. And here's hill number 1 after it was built and drilled and production was underway. Here's a typical drilling crew of that time period. The guy in the center is probably the boss. I'm talking about the dog there, but the boots, no hard-toed shoes, no hard hats, just a typical crew of that time period. This is the Clevenger family. If some of you may even know the Clevenger family, but they're very, this was the young Clevengers. They lived on Orchid Hill, but look in the background, you see tent-sided roof, tents for a roof, and then wooden-sided homes. This was quite common throughout the oil fields. By the way, we'll get in here to it in a minute, but there were more homes in Orcutt Hill, if you will, than there ever was in San Maria Valley up until the year about 1912, 1915. Then the community began to grow, but we'll get into that in a second. This is Old Maud flowing over the Crown, a picture taken by my grandfather. They made them into postcards, and they were quite a saleable item. And here we are building some of the dams with Fresnos. Those are scrapers that they haul behind teams of horses, and actually damming up the canyons and then letting the oil flow in behind it from Old Maud. They did this whole series all the way down the canyon, and you can see one after another. Here's another one, the Hartnell heirs. These are all the gentlemen. They'd come down from San Francisco for the day to see what they had on their property, and it looks like all the ladies got a new fur coat, at least. This was the Hartnell heirs. But as you can see, another aerial view, if you will, from on top of the hill, looking down on those things. And here, because of that, then we had to do something about excavating it. We had the narrow gauge railroad running, the Pacific Coast Railroad running through there, but they didn't have any tankers or anything to haul the oil in. It wasn't until George T. Windler out of San Francisco, California, built enough redwood tanks that they began to, through gravity flow, begin to take the oil out of those sumps and put it in tank cars and take it to San Francisco. And it was very, well, we won't get into that, but it was a big use during the paving of the streets of San Francisco and that kind of things. But anyway, here we are building a pipeline from Orcutt Hill all the way up to Avila, California, or Port Hartford, if you will. And this is almost right where we're sitting here today, just slightly to the west and slightly to the south of us, along the old Pacific Coast Railroad right away. The town of Orcutt would be up in the upper right-hand corner, if you will. Here is the original first settings for the town of Orcutt. We're looking down Markham Street, if you will. You see the little White House, and I haven't gotten into this, but some beautiful stories about the town of La Graciosa. We talked very briefly about it. A guy by the name of Livingston with the Smithsonian had, through the 1950s, the 40s and 50s, spent a lot of time here trying to find the town site of La Graciosa. It had the first hangings, the first voting precincts. It had the first schools outside of Los Alamos, and it was quite a prolific town. But it was made up of all, well, how do I want to say this? Not reputable people, but mostly, and they were squatters. The Hartnells said, hey, you can't be squatting on our property. They came down, tried to run them out. They weren't able to do so, took them to court, and the court yielded that they needed $40,000 in restitution, and they did that and ran the people out of the town, and actually the Hartnells came down and actually physically burnt the town down. So that's why nobody knows where the township is. The white building that you see in the background there is the only building left out of the town of La Graciosa. And it was dragged by horseback, or by horses, I should say, horseback, dragged by horses to this site, somewhat near the corner of Markham and Clark Streets in downtown Orcutt. And you can see what the Union Oil Company was doing. They were frantically building tankage alongside the Pacific Coast Railroad in order to bring that oil from Old Maud and other wells that they now had developed. And the township of Orcutt was beginning to develop. Now, William Warren Orcutt laid out the town site of Orcutt in 1904. And he did it for what we call, in those days terms, rope, dope, and soap people. Now, it wasn't dope like we know today, but it was pipe dope, painting, and things of that nature, and the ropes and the materials that they needed to develop the oil fields. Companies like National Supply, which now has been turned into a restaurant over here at 205 Broadway Street, the Oil Well Supply, a whole bunch of those types of companies came and started to build in Orcutt. Now remember, this is the environmental correction, the way they handled. Remember those sumps of oil from Old Maud? The year is now 1910, 1911, and what they did was sprinkle straw on it, go in with diesel fuel or with what we call drip gas, pour on it, set it on fire. But I can tell you to this day, you cannot find where those old sumps were, and there's animals and cattle were grazing on it by the year 1914, and I've got some pictures here in a moment that are showing. Here's the production headquarters for the Standard Oil Company of California. This is on Orcutt Hill, was not a part, but you can see their meager beginnings. There's the foreman and the superintendent and probably the roustabout. This is building a location at Dome 10, Orcutt Hill. Just a little way from where we sat. They didn't do anything to disturb the ground. They actually just cleared the trees, if you will, and then built to conform. There's the derrick built to conform to the hillside. That happened to be Dome 10 on Orcutt Hill, a very prolific well. If you look very close where those steam puffs are coming up out of the ground, you can see some poles and you can see some things. Actually electricity. Well, Orcutt Hill had electricity while the coal oil lamp was still being used in the San Maria Valley, and most of Orcutt Hill was on the electric light. Here you can see the electric lines going across. This is at the foot of the Pinal Grade, Orcutt Hill. If you've ever been able to go up that way to the Union Hall picnic grounds and up in that part. This is the electrical generating plant on top of Orcutt Hill. And the tent off to the right was one of my grandparents' homes, if you will. They're stick-built homes in the foreground, but they were still in the, I guess he didn't have enough seniority or enough push to get anything in a stick-built home, but they were living in that tent off to the right. And here we are at Pinal on Orcutt Hill, just a little ways from where we sat here now. But you notice no roads into it. Everything was horseback. Yes, there were trails and some roads over on the right-hand side that went in there, but everything was by wagon. When a man had a string of wells and worked on them, he actually physically took his lunch pail and did his string of wells. It might be a 5-mile walk around his string of wells, and he would go throughout the day and then return in the evening back to home. They did it both horseback and they did it on foot, normally on foot. Here we are, the year is about 1919. We're getting paint on the houses. We're getting a little bit more modern. This is the Orcutt Hill. These wooden derricks were very prolific all over the hill, and the last of them were taken down about 1965, 1970. Okay, here we are downtown Orcutt, looking up Clark Avenue. On the left here, you can see the Pacific Coast Railroad. You can see some features here. Here we are, same scene, just a little bit higher. That's the Pacific Coast Railroad warehouse there on the left at the corner of Markham and Clark Streets. And the two structures I've been, boy, everybody's been on my tail, those are oil wells in downtown Orcutt. No, they aren't oil wells. They were water wells. Matter of fact, those water wells still exist to this day. But I've had a number of people get up in arms that we got wells that weren't abandoned in downtown Orcutt. No, not the case. These were both water wells downtown Orcutt. We're looking towards 201 South Broadway, downtown Orcutt. Here we are just across the street. You remember that tank? There it is finished in the back, and now we have a processing plant for pumping the oil on up to Avila and so forth, and a cleaning station to clean the oil. And my grandfather is standing on top of a tank looking due south up towards Rigetti Ranch and Divide Substation, if you will. Here we are downtown Orcutt. The little girls are at the corner of Markham. Everybody knows where Elmer's is at. Elmer's is up at the second power pole up there, or a telephone pole up the street here. Here we are with a sheep drive. I talked a little bit about sheep. The year here now is about 1905, 1906. Elmer's is just over the top of the wagon on the right there. And Austini's blacksmith shop was just about where this picture was taken from. And of course, you can't have, being a cattleman, you got to have cattle, and this is a cattle drive. They drove a lot of cattle from all the ranches here and would bring them in by railroad at Guadalupe and then distribute them out to the ranches, and that's what this picture is about, but it's just a few years later. Take a look at this picture real quickly. This is looking at the country kitchen. I guess it's still in existence, I don't know, but this is downtown Orcutt on the north side of the street, all wagons, and the picture is taken about 1906, 1907, but take a look at this next one. Same corner, we're just taking a little bit different angle. The picture's taken about 1912. The Orcutt Mercantile was built in 1911. And it's that big building you see in the background, but we've gone from horse and buggy all the way to automobiles, and you can see all of the oil piping on the trucks, an old white